Hey, how are you, bud? Good to see you.
Hello there, young lady.
Thanks for coming out.
Oh, good. Bless your
I finally made it.
soul. Bless you.
Yeah.
Look here, Dale.
I had a change of plans at 7 this morning, so I made it.
Oh, my goodness.
How are you?
Well, good morning, everybody. I believe the gang's all here. Oh, that's nice. Listen, welcome. And I do want to introduce, we have a few guests here today, and I'd like to introduce them to you. And if you would, I hope I won't embarrass you, would you stand up at least so people can see you? Dale he is part of a men's breakfast club. And I wonder sometimes what they talk about. I'd love to be a fly on the wall. But anyway, he has several he has several of his fellows and some of their wives that are here today to hear Dale. And Mac and Kylene Hilton, you guys stand up back there, raise your hand or something so everybody can see who you are. Okay, EJ and Linda Vaught. Yep. And Bud Jeffries. Okay. And Jan, you're part of that group too, aren't you, sometimes?
No, we butt in on the end of it, and we pull Dale out.
Okay. All right. Anyway, we are so glad to have you here. Diana, let me introduce you as well because we do have guests. Diana is our senior pastor here, Diana White. Yeah, please. And then Kent over here, who is our associate pastor and all-around guy. And let me start by asking, talk a little bit about an update on some of our seniors. Jan and Shirley, how's Shirley, Jan?
She's okay, she's home,
Yeah,
and wearing herself out every day.
is she?
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
But she's doing all right.
Okay. How are you?
I'm okay.
Good, good. I know, you're anxious to get home, I'm sure.
I won't be there anytime soon.
Yeah, well. And Louise Stafford, last night Nelson Sifford said, Louise, of course, is back over here at Commonwealth, and he said she is finally acting a bit jovial again. And so that's always good to hear. Yeah, always good to hear. John and I had the opportunity to see Judy Cabbage last night, and Judy seems to be doing okay, and so is her son, Brian. He looks really good. You know, he had the kidney transplant, and he is, let me take this off while I talk, and he's doing well. Hilda seems to be doing well. She's so cute when we take her dinner on Wednesday night. Hilda always likes to come to the door for us to see her. And that's always a good thing. We always like to see Hilda. Suzanne Morris, same thing. She seems to be doing well. How about anybody else? Any other updates on some of our seniors? Okay. I just wanted to say, since we're having a church-wide picnic in May, I think what we'll do, rather than trying to do something special with our senior adult group, we had talked about maybe trying to go to a restaurant. That what we'll do is do another caravan. I'm especially thinking about Elizabeth Hallett because, as you may know, Elizabeth is going to be moving to Texas. She's going to be leaving and moving to Texas to live with her son Terry and his wife. That's going to be huge for Elizabeth because she is like her sister Lucille. She has wanted desperately to stay here, and she's managed to do that for a long time. But this will be a good thing for her. And I think she's sort of, she's agreed to do that and is, it feels like that's maybe the right move for her as well. But I thought that would be a nice thing, a send-off for her, if we could go by and see her before she takes off in June. Maybe we want to go by and see Esther Powell. I chatted with Esther, and bless her heart, she is so upbeat. She stays so upbeat despite the issues that she's having, and was excited about going to down to Florida to a grandson's wedding, I think. So we'll look at going by and seeing a couple people maybe sometime in May since the weather has gotten nicer. Now, we're going to have our own Lloyd Peoples come and do our devotional this morning. Those of us in the congregation already know and love Lloyd. He has been a part of our congregation for some time now. He is a former minister, and we love him because he is part of the Amen Corner over here on Sunday morning. Amen. That's right, exactly, and we love that. We love that. And so, Lloyd, if you will come and do our devotional for us.
Thank you, Mary Ann. What a blessing it is to be here this morning to engage in some activities, not only for our senior citizens, but to bring back some memories and some information that I am not aware of. I was just discussing this morning with a friend about a picture of Dale that is posted up on the screen here. It reminds me of my uncle who was stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And that's another hometown friend there from Ohio. Anyway, this event is a blessing for us to bring about some information and share with each other as God has allowed our golden moments to roll on a little while longer. And as we say that, it is a blessing not only to see you all, but to be here with you. And so as we go to God in prayer, let us pray. Our God and our Father, we're so thankful for you to allow us to assemble ourselves together as we listen to Dale to give us some insight and information. God, we pray that you would continue to bless him and strengthen him as we all go together and share of your riches and your blessings. We pray that you will continue to bless this pastor, Diana Farewell, and our associated pastor, Brother Kent, and all of our staff that is here at First Baptist. And God, we just say thank you. And thank you for what you have done. Thank you for what you're going to do. And thank you for what you will do. Heavenly Father, we continue to lift up prayers for our people in Ukraine and our nation as a whole, Father. We still need you, and we cannot get along without you. For with you all things are possible, and without you we cannot do nothing. So God, as we get ready now to embark upon another day's journey, we say thank you. Thank you, thank you, and thank you. In Jesus' name we do pray, amen, and thank God.
Amen.
Brother Dale.
And now, without further ado, we're going to have our main presenter come up, Dale Kleppin. I think everybody already knows Dale, so I'm not going to try to introduce him. I'm going to let Dale just kind of introduce himself and tell about his lustrous career.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you folks for all coming out to see and hear me. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Okay. Well, that is me. And that's the Air Force uniform I proudly wore from 1952 to 1956, just before I entered the University of Washington. And I received my degree in aeronautical engineer, a Bachelor of Science degree, in 1959, and I had been working for Boeing, and I slipped right into an engineer's job after I completed my degree. There's my, the first program I worked on, or was assigned to, was the Minuteman. Now, I've got a crude model. I made some crude models here that kind of demonstrate what they are, but that's an intercontinental ballistic missile. And the ballistic part is that there's no control over it after it leaves the, well, it's in the silo now, but there's no control over it after it leaves. And it's about 60 feet tall and about 5.5 feet at the base. And it's 3 stages, and you can kind of see the marks there that indicate where the stages are. And that means there's 3 individual rocket engines. And the first one burns out, drops away, the second one burns out, and so forth, and on to the third one. It had nothing to do with the top there, which is the bomb that's going to go off when it lands. And incidentally, the propellant for the third stage, so it was just solid, all of them are solid, was made out of here and across the river in Radford Arsenal. So it's a connection with that you may not remember.
What was the, excuse me, what was the chemical form? What was the exact propellant? What was it? Did you understand my question? What was the propellant?
What was the bomb?
What was the propellant, he said?
Propellant, I don't really know but it's solid, but I don't really know what the component was. Some of the people here that worked there may have worked over there, might know what that was, but I don't know. Since this was a solid propellant rocket, it accelerates very, very fast. And so there's skin friction with air, which causes outside to receive a lot of heating. And therefore, the device needs a heat shield. And that was the group that I was assigned to at Boeing right away, was the heat shield design group. I say group, but there was a group leader, a runner, and me. And so there was not very much known about materials that would survive anything like heating of that nature. So we immediately began doing tests to determine what possibly we could use to keep that thing from getting too hot and exploding. The main type of materials we were looking at were ablative, and that means that they went from solid to liquid and then to gas and were erased away by the friction. And so we began a program of testing and models that were, well, we used an arc jet, which is good simulation for that type of heating. And the models we used were maybe, 3 or 4 inches in square. They had the heat shield material bonded to a steel substrate, and it had a thermocouple in back. And so the information we got from that test was basically the temperature rise, and I think we were limiting it to something like 400 degrees, and the amount of material that was ablated off the front, and of course the heating. And we took that information on each of the tests and combined it with information that was measured in the lab, such as the density and the thermal conductivity and a few things like that that were specific to that material, and created a model that we could use a computer with. Now, computers were in process, but hadn't been used too much in the engineering field. I think, first introduced to it about the time I started college. So there were some of those, and we did use those to take that information and create the thicknesses required for the various components, because each one of these usually had a different heating rate and so forth. So I don't know how many there were. But anyway, the powers that be then could take that information, and after we assembled a large amount of it, they took everything into consideration, like how long it would last and how expensive it was and how easy to apply and all kinds of other things, along with the heating performance, and selected 3 of them, or probably, I don't remember exactly, but they started into a full-scale testing program. And I was selected to be on one of the teams that they called Quick Look. Now, the testing was done, of course, down at what was then Cape Canaveral. I don't know what it is. It's called Cape Kennedy, I guess now, or County Missile Research Center, or whatever. I don't know what it is, but it was down in Florida. And so we started a program of doing full-scale testing on these. And we had these quick look teams. The purpose of the quick look teams was to go down there as quick as we could get information. Well, actually, some of the people went down beforehand to make sure the missile was going to work all right. But we went down there to do that, get the information dirty right off of the receivers. They came out in strip charts that you've probably seen in the doctor's or dentist's office that squigglies on it. And there were about 6 measurements, time code, and stuff like that on the charts. And so we quickly would look those over when we got down there and where they were available, because, again, the computers were slow and it took time to get that all out. And we looked for things that we did not expect to see, that would indicate that we had a problem. And the reason for that, of course, was that we could then call immediately back to Seattle, and they had telephones at that time, and get people working on the problem right away to if they had to make changes, get ready for the next missile that was going to be fired. And our work down there then was to take each one of those strips and get into a large hangar and stretch those out and meticulously read the deflection of each one of our measurements and apply the calibration factor and come up with a number for it. And we had, particularly in my case, usually they were pretty smooth curves, so I didn't need a lot of them to define exactly how the material responded. Others would look for particular things that they were concerned about, and usually I didn't have anything that I was very concerned about, except once in a while we'd put in an extra patch of material that might be used if we had something come up that would negate the use of the one we'd figured we were using. And so we did this for, an accelerated time. I'm not sure how many times I went down there. I think I went down there about twice a month. And of course, that wasn't took almost a whole week, because in those days we flew on the prop jets and took 2 or 3 stops on the way down, and it took a day to get down there, and sometimes we didn't get down there till night. And we tried to fly into, I can't remember the name of the city, but it was over on the coast close to Cocoa Beach. sometimes we made it, sometimes we had to go to Orlando or places like that and drive over. But I went down there for, I don't know, it lasted for several months, really. And so we originally were launching all of them off of a pad. And while the wheels that be were deciding how they were going to deploy these things, they looked at a lot of different ways. They thought about putting them on trains and parking them in hills and then running them around to different places at night to hide them and put them on a truck and all kinds of things. But they finally decided that they would have to put these in underground silos. And so these were put in the ground, and they then could roll a heavy door over the top of them to protect them, and which I guess could be quickly removed if we wanted to get started on them, had to get started on them, shoot them back, you know, at an enemy. So after they put them in the silos, of course, we had to take a couple or three shots out of there to make sure that something wasn't happening, and that something was happening, because first thing they were concerned about was acoustics in there, and so they lined the whole thing with some foam material or something. I don't know what it was, but we went out and looked around there, and it was a mess. I mean, there's black stuff everywhere. Anyway, we finished that part of the program, and everything turned out to be very well. They had final material selected. They had everything looked to be in good shape. So you can imagine what was happening to the workforce after we got into that phase, so declining very fast in the Seattle area. And I think over time it went from over 100,000 down to around 40,000. So after I got to that point, I started looking around, of course, for where I wanted to go. But I was very, very happy to work on that program, because I found out later that it had come in on time and under budget. And being a massive program like that, it had to be well managed, everything. And as of about 2011, I think it was, there were about 1,000 of these deployed in underground silos around the United States. I'm not sure where exactly. There were in 6 silos, 6 different locations, but there were 100,000 of them, not 100,000, there were 1,000 of them. And because of a treaty about that time, that has been reduced to something like 400 in 3 locations scattered around the country. So the next, so looking around for a job, I tried to get ahead of the program so I don't want to be unemployed. I found job in Massachusetts working for a place called Avco, and they were working on the Apollo program. Now, a few people probably watched all the television, everything, in 1969, a couple years ago, the 50th anniversary, so you may know more about it than I do. But anyway, that was, the booster for that looked very similar to well, that's not the booster, but I'll get to this one in a minute, but the booster for that is very similar to looking like the Minuteman, but that's where the similarity disappears. First of all, this is now 360 feet tall, and it's 33.5 feet in diameter at the base. And instead of being solid, it's a liquid propellant. And of course, the reason for being a liquid propellant is that there are going to be humans that are going to be sent up in that, and they cannot stand accelerations of the magnitude that Minuteman would produce. I think we used an acceleration of 5 Gs as a limit for where people could experience that and still perform. And at 10, we figured they were going. Well, anyway, I'll go to the next one. Anytime we launched one of these that had humans in them, and now I'm going to be talking about the trips that were taken to the moon, not all the testing that went on before this, because they ran tests and tests on every system to make sure that individual things were carefully done, because we had humans in it. And of course, when we started this, Kennedy did, back in 61 or so, we didn't know what we didn't know. And one of the first things that really came to mind is, how do you get there? I mean, we had people that thought, well, you're going to take a big, long thing like this and go all the way to the moon. Well, can't do that. That's just out of the question. And so they finally decided that the only way they're going to do it is to go into orbit around the Earth first, and then leave the Earth and go into orbit around the moon before you landed on it. So that's what happened during the moon thing. Now, this is a little object that is on here, and by the way, you can look at these afterwards if you'd like. It shows, they're crude, some of them, but this is, of course, the module. The top of it there, the cylindrical part down here is what they call the service module. Provides all of the crew support, and the top part of it is where the crew is, the conical part. And there are 3 astronauts, of course, in that, and the volume is a little over 200 cubic feet, so they don't really have a lot of room. But all of the life support is through that little thing that shines there. There's a thing that comes down. And now this is the part that goes on top of the 300-foot, 360-foot rocket that I mentioned, shown before. And this went on all of the flights that had people on it. But there were additional things that had to be put on. If, for instance, on top of it was a what they call a crew escape thing, which if they had trouble on the pad before it took off, or if shortly within the flight they discovered a problem, they could lift the crew off of there and parachute them down to safety. Underneath here, underneath the service module, which is the conical section, housed the things that would go to the moon. Now, it wasn't on here in the fall flights because some of the flights just went around and surveyed where they might land. And but when they went to the moon, they had and wanted to get stuff. That was all down here, a lunar lander, and sometimes there was a rover in there and whatever else they needed to be used on the moon. We're in that conical section. So this whole thing then would go into orbit around the Earth. And they'd check out everything, make sure it was working correctly. And then they would fire the residual fuel in that third stage of the big long rocket, and it would kick the whole thing out of orbit and send it to the moon. Then that third stage would drop off, of course, after it was burned out. And then they would immediately fly all of the stuff. If they were going to the moon, they'd fly all of this stuff around and hook it on to the front of the whole assembly there. And then they would use this rocket to make in-course corrections. And also it had to be turned around and slowed the whole thing down so that they could go into orbit around the moon. Then it would be lit off again when they got through with their experiments or whatever they were going to do, and it would be the thing that kicked it out of orbit for the return to the Earth. And also it would be used to make in-course corrections if they were needed, and it would be also used to slow it down a little bit when it entered the Earth's atmosphere, because it was going fast. I'll get to that in a minute. Now, what did I do on this program? Well, first of all, I did work about a year on the third stage of the rocket. And it's kind of a plumber's nightmare because it's liquid and they got pipes running everywhere. And my job was to make sure that they got the liquid to the right place, whether it's gas or liquid gas. Get it the right place, the right pressure, at the right time, and considering all the bends and everything. So I did that for about a year. And then when I got through with that, I went back, when I was at AVCO, I designed the heat shield that is between the conical section and the cylindrical section. Now, that heat shield was, I thought it was pretty thick. I thought it was like about 3 inches thick, but I think I've read it might be, 2 or 2.5 inches. Anyway, it was a strange application. They bonded a honeycomb onto the metal core there. It's underneath there. By the way, that's rounded underneath there. It's not squared off flat, but it's rounded. And they bonded that onto the metal, and it went along with like what I call a cookie shooter. And a guy would fill each one of those little holes in the thing with this, I don't know, it came out like putty or grease or something, and that made up the heat shield. Well, I became concerned about that, or I expressed concern about that, because I didn't know whether they'd get all the way to the bottom of that honeycomb when they got in there, and things like that. And so I questioned that, and their method of checking it was to have them stop every once in a while and make a sample copy of it on a bench and cut it up. But of course, when you get people that do that kind of work, nobody kind of does that kind of work. You really don't get people that are, the average type of person, I think, could do that all day long, pushing the anyway, that's the way they did it. Now, everything in this program, on the Apollo program, had to be done with precision. I mean, and it seemed like every time they did something, it didn't come out quite right the way they wanted. They had a group of guys at MIT lab doing the computer work on it, and very smart guys. And but the computer codes that they were coming up with were Cadillacs. They did everything. Well, they had to come in and tell these guys, no, we just want to have bare bones, but it's got to be, because every pound that you add to the vehicle on the ground has to be, you got to put 3 pounds to get it up and get it through the prime. So you got to keep it right down. And like I say, they really didn't even know how they were going to do it until very late in the program, how they were going to get the whole thing done. But, they did it. And it was a very successful program. And They did have a little problem with, early on with burning some guys up because they were on the pad and the environment caught fire and they perished. But like I say, everything had to be precise. And I'll just demonstrate that. I've read in the book that when this thing was coming into the Earth's atmosphere, it had to be aligned within 1 degree in order to come in right. And they're coming in at 25,000 miles an hour. If they're not right, if they're too shallow, they'll skip off into space and no way to return. If it's too steep, they burn up. So we had no problem on reentry, so that was great. Well, when that program began to get through, next slide, please. This shows the part that I was involved in, and then there's a heat shield that goes underneath there. And this is after it had been recovered. And of course, we had to also look at all these doors and stuff like that to make sure we had flight. So after that is when I went to Douglas for a year and did the work on the third stage of this. And then I didn't care too much for California, and all the weather was nice. It just didn't seem like the environment was good for the family. And then one of my good friends from back in Massachusetts, who also worked for AVCO but at a different division, and knew that we were completely satisfied with California, told me to come on back. And they were looking for engineers, and they offered a bounty on it, and he'd share with me if I came back. So, then I returned to AVCO, and different division, and it seemed like they were involved strictly in developing materials that could be used for the different types of heating, and well, also anything. But we investigated heating such as building materials, buildings, and some aerospace, and house fires, rocket engines, anything that developed heat, we kind of ran tests on and tried to get material that would take care of it. They didn't sell much that I know of. They did sell some material that you could spray on building substructures, the steel beams and so forth. And what it would do, it'd give you an extra maybe 3 hours. It didn't save this thing, but it gave you 3 hours for people to escape the building and get out safely. I think that sold pretty well. Another material they developed was a 3D wound material that they could make missile parts out of that served both as heat shield and the structure. And we sold that to British, and so I got involved with that, and I had to make a couple trips to London to teach them how to design with it. They had a computer, we needed to show them how to do it. One of those I got to take Gene with me, another material they tried to develop and sell was material that they could make golf club shafts out of. Now, they didn't ask me to test that, of course. Of course, part of that decision was based on the way they'd probably seen me play. But anyway, then it turned into I was running out to to the base out there that you mentioned before where you were.
Right, Pat.
Wright-Patterson, yes. Wright-Patterson had a laser that we used, and we took all kinds of samples out there, tried to see if we could see how long it took to burn through them and so forth. And a lot of it was bladder material, fuel bladder material that they had in airplanes, and I think they were trying to get a material that they could sell for that. Anyway, that went on for quite some time. I don't know, I worked for several years in that location, and there were a lot of little things that came up all the way along that hardly were worth winning. And then my career took a slightly different jog. I think I don't remember it, what exactly happened, and I think the good Lord had something to do with the way it happened, but I was at a conference out in Arizona, and a complete stranger came up to me, knew my name, and introduced himself, and said his company was looking for a person that, with my experience and testing, particularly, and that he wondered if I might be interested in sending in an application. Hey, what do I do? Well, why not take a chance? So I did. He sent me something to fill out, and I gave him my resume and all that. And very shortly after that, I got called in for an interview, and the result was that I ended up very quickly with a nice offer to come to work for him in something that was a little bit new. The place was called Command Avidyne, and it was a little satellite office of a large corporation called Command Sciences Corporation, which is located in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And they are a subdivision of the main corporation, which is just command headquarters in Connecticut. And I mentioned all the three of the commands, and they're spelled with a K instead of a C, because they started by a guy named Charlie Command, who had all kinds of businesses all over the world, I think, anyway. But I was particularly mentioned those three because I had interaction with them in addition to several other command locations. So I try to not mix things up too much. Well, this particular satellite office, which was small, about 40 people, including the janitor and receptionist, specialized in nuclear effects, and more clearly should have been, it specialized in how do you limit the amount of damage if you get into a nuclear war. And of course, nothing that can be designed hardly that will survive a nuclear explosion, but there are things that can be done that will build them a little stronger, separate them a little bit further apart. Then that means that the enemy has to take each one out individual, and that's not in what the war games they play, they think they'll do. So anyway, that's what we were trying to do. And I was assigned to the Aeronautical Division, which was slightly behind the curve in what to do. Our company had developed a code that would predict how an airplane going down there would, in an intersection of a blast wave would hit it, what the interaction would do to the lift characteristics of the wing. And of course, with any kind of a system like that, you want to know how the computer system is going to work before it's really used to design airplanes. So was my job to be the test engineer in that kind of development. Now, I'm going to step back a little bit. When the Air Force became a separate part of the military back in, I think, in the late 40s after World War II, the development of jet airplanes introduced several problems that they hadn't seen before. One of them was, for instance, how do you do supersonic stuff in a wind tunnel, because shock waves and everything are going to mess everything up. Another thing was, particularly was escaping from one of these jet airplanes that's going near Mach 1 safely without getting hit by the tail, and was not possible. They did have propulsion systems, but I don't think they worked that well and probably couldn't do the job either. Well, anyway, the Air Force built a facility out in New Mexico near White Sands and a little town called, senior moment, come to me in a minute. But anyway, they built this out there for this kind of testing of supersonic stuff, and they did all kinds of testing. I didn't even remember the types of testing that they did out there, but one of them would be to put explosives next to a test track, and if I have that one here, this is a test track. This is a facility. And if you imagine a railroad track that extends out into the desert about 10 miles, that's as flat as they can make it and as straight as they can make it, that's the basic part of it. Now, the rails are, you notice there's no ties, but the rails are put on concrete. And you put a rocket engine on the back of it, and you've got a reverse of an wind tunnel. Instead of the blade where get going fast over the wing, this goes fast over moderately still there. So it's a reverse of the wind tunnel. And so you can put say the next slide, please. Yeah, it's okay. That's okay. So you put a model on it, and this is not to scale. Again, it's a crude model, but it just demonstrates what's going to happen. That thing is going to go down the track when this thing's lit off. And if you put explosives on this other side of the thing, you can simulate the shock wave hitting the wing. Now, the explosives they used were something called anfold. And if that might ring a bell with you, as you remember the Oklahoma City courthouse that was blown up, that's what was used out there. It was anfold, the main material. I think that McVeigh, I think his name was, juiced it up a little bit with something. But it's a common material that's used in construction, and the Air Force had done a lot of testing, and it provided the shock wave about like they're going to just be simulated without all the nasty effects of the thing. So my job then was to, well, before I get to my job, I want to mention the facility a little bit more, because there's a couple of interesting things that apply to us. It received quite a bit of publicity in, I think about 1954 it started. by a guy named John Paul Stapp. He was born in Brazil to Baptist missionary parents, by the way, and a very smart fella. He was homeschooled, I think, probably up to high school, but he was fluent, I think, in 4 languages. He went on to Baylor, I think, after high school, and received a master's, and then he got his PhD in biophysics, which, yeah, kind of hard to describe what biophysics is, but it is really what happens, things according to physics laws and so forth. So they studied how blood flows and stuff like that and all this stuff. Anyway, he got his PhD in that. Then right shortly after that, he started medical school and became a medical doctor too. And when he got his degree, he was almost through World War II. I think he got it in 1944, as a matter of fact. And after going through some boot camp for medical people and things like that, he finally got out to Wright-Patterson because they had the Air Force Medical Command stationed there. And they asked him if he would go on with some research that the Germans had started that we'd confiscated the information on to investigate trying to provide safety for the pilots that were bailing out. And so he agreed to do that and started his testing out in California near what now is Edwards Air Force Base, but eventually got sent down to this facility here. And right after he got started on this, he realized that really he could do a lot more with it than saving pilots' lives. If he could get the automobile industry, or anyway in transportation, to install seatbelts, we could save a lot of lives. And so because he thought that the kind of accidents that we have are more than their kind of impact. And he thought that humans could take a lot more G's than the 10 that were now listed as top thing. So he set about not only solving the Air Force problems, but also spending a lot of time going around the world, really, beating the drum for seatbelts on transportation vehicles. In fact, he actually got into trouble with his commanding officers because he thought he was spending too much time trying to save the world and not enough time doing their job. Anyway, the last test that he ran to prove out his point was they put a chair on a place that's mounted just about where that wing is mounted. And they strapped him into it, secured his arms and legs, and gave him a helmet. And he planned this with adding, he called in, of course the military came, but he called in people from Congress, he called in the automobile people, he called in the press, he called in the television, everything. He wanted everybody could get to view this. And they shot him off. And it hit a water dam that had been in place. There were 2 little water dams that they could put water in this trough to simulate deceleration. And he got up to a speed of 630 miles an hour when he hit this water break. He came to a complete stop in less than a second and a half. And it turned out that he registered above 30 Gs. So that went a long ways to proving to the government and to everybody that by installing safety belts, they could save a lot of lives. Well, it didn't, Congress didn't buy it right, well, they didn't act on it right away. But several governors did, and eventually it became a law. But he's been given credit for doing that. And so anyway, I went back to testing. I wasn't put on there in that C to test out the system. But that's where I did my testing of this thing. Then we ran the first of my tests. So what I had to do when in the testing program was, of course, I had to get a model designed to use in our tests. And of course, my hand is being held by group meter all the way through this on the first time. And so I had to go around and get a model made after getting several quotes on how it was. And it was made in two parts, and it would have little holes for them to mount transducers, pressure transducers, flush with the outside surface so that we could measure the response of the air currents over it. And there were about 4 or 5 different rows of them along each wing. And then the rings are put together, and the threads are going down here and into a recorder on board. And so after I did that, of course, I had to get the purchasing people involved in getting contracts out for the wing and for the transducers, and I had to deal with people down at, that was all done down at command headquarters. And so after I got that done, I was a little bit curious about the whole thing because, first of all, I didn't have to write a test plan. And then I was asked to do or told to do a stress analysis of all of this, the wing and its connection and everything up there. And I wondered about that a little bit, and then I had to do a static test on that thing too. I had to write a test program to do a static test. And I wondered, why do I have to do all of this stuff? Well, it then dawned on me that probably the reason was that they had run one test like this. I found some notes in the office they gave me that said that they had done some of this testing before. So I think that they had run one test and had a structural failure somewhere along the line. So they wanted to make sure that we had no structural failure. So I had to go through all that. Then the last thing that I had to do was a long computation on how to establish a trigger to get this whole thing going once they started the engine. And what they used for a trigger was a fork that was set alongside the track that had a wire connected between the thongs, and they had a cutter on the edge of this model. I don't know. I think on this front thing that contained the model that started the igniter, and then the shock wave came from there to the track. And of course, the Army or the Air Force had done a lot of studies, so we kind of knew exactly how that was. So I had to take all of those things into account in my calculation to make sure that we hit a precise point on the middle at the precise angle that they were looking for, at the precise level of pressure they were looking for. Because if you don't get exact numbers, you don't have good data. Well, that was quite a long analysis had to be done. Of course, that had to do this with my model going about 600 miles an hour too. So anyway, I did that and checked it, of course, and then my boss checked it. And so I gathered from all that this probably went along with the failure they'd had before, and they didn't want to have another failure. Small office like that, if you have more than one failure with something like this, they probably don't give you any more contracts. Anyway, I had to pull all that together, and we'd go out a day or two before the actual firing and take a tape out and measure exactly where the detonator was going to be and where my trigger was that I'd calculated supposed to be, and made sure that everything was checked out completely. So everything had set up for the first series of tests, and we ran 3 tests. There were 3 explosives made along the line as the thing went down. And so I had to do with the analysis like 3 times. And we ran the first wing through that. It came out fine. Everything worked right, the good data, no problems with failures of any kind. So then they decided that this was a rigid model, of course. It was a casting. So they wanted to do something that was a little more representative of an airplane, which has a little bit of fluctuation. It's not a solid wing, but it fluctuates a little bit. So they managed to get them, well, we couldn't build one, so they managed to get a wing from a cruise missile that was flexible, implemented it, and I went through the normal procedures then of doing the preliminary testing and analysis and everything like that had to be done. And we ran the first test, and everything worked fine. Good data, everything. So then got ready for the second test, and well, we're going to get ready for the second test. We went home, and about the next day, my boss got a telephone call and said, we had an accident with the model, bring it back to the laboratory. And we destroyed the model. And, but they were working on finding another one, and they said there'd probably be about a 3-month delay in the program. Now, here's Dale sitting at a real small place, a little few people, hardly problem finding a work for him and paying his salary. But so happens that there was something else available, and within a couple of days, I had 2 or 3 of the top people in our department come into my office and ask me if I would go down to Washington, D.C., and serve in a little office down there that had maybe, 6 or 7 people in it with different areas of expertise. And they're thermal specialists who had to go away for some medical procedure, and he would be out for about 3 months. And they wanted me to go down and take his place. Now, this little office was run out of the command headquarters. And I said, well, okay, let me check with Jean. And I called her, and she said, when can we leave, you know? Anyway, so I went back to him, and I said, well, sure, I'll go down there. And I figured I'd probably could live in a motel, or if I could find something else anyway, and she could join me, because our kids were in college. And so I said, well, I'll go down there, but, you know, this is going to be through October, November, and December, and it gets cold up in New England, and I'm kind of want to be able to check on my house, so I need to come back at least once a month to check on my house. And I hardly got it down, and they said, yes, we'll do it. And I think they expected me to ask for a trip back every week, you know. Anyway, I went down there and found a place for, I think they called it transient condominium, which was a little tiny thing with a little kitchen with a few utensils and a bar that you could use as a table, and a tiny living room, and of course, bedroom and shower and so forth. And Jean came down very quickly then, and we set up housekeeping for 3 months. And the job was with, I think, a part of the government called DARPA, which stands for Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And don't get too upset. Don't concentrate too much on the advanced research part of that, because in thermodynamics, we aren't inventing too many things. So we know that all advanced research probably involves some heating, and I had plenty of experience in analyzing heating problems and knew pretty much what to do. So I was qualified to rub noses with people that did some of the advanced research. But, of course, at that time of the year, most of the contracts have been awarded, and they haven't done enough business to really demand solve any questions that the government might have. So I did that for 3 months, and Jean had a great time. She went shopping, Christmas shopping. She went and visited all the museums, and we even got tickets to the Kennedy Center for their big extravaganza, and she went through the White House at that time. And I don't know who was the president at that time, because I'm not exactly where this occurred in time, but it was either Nancy Reagan or Mrs. Carter, I think, one of the two. Anyway, rushed home after that. The company always gave you the day of before Christmas and Christmas. So rushed home. I left early that day before that and rushed home and went out and got a Christmas tree set up. Perfect height, about 6 feet, but the bottom was about 8 feet across. So what I could find. Anyway, then after that, I went back to the testing. They had everything set up, and we got going again, and went through the same procedures on the cruise missile wing. Things came out fine. Then they thought they wanted that maybe when we were looking at things like this, we ought to look at a jet engine that might be affected by it. So there's a company up in Michigan named Williams that was producing small jet engines that they were using on cruise missiles. And I think they're now using them on small jet airplanes too, probably. So after several trips up there to Walleye, Michigan, to their company place, we arranged to have them put a operating jet engine on the sled, where that is, and remotely control it to start it and to turn it off. And we set up the explosives like that, and that was part of my job, and get it to swallow the shock wave at the right conditions. And I worked with the engineer up there, and he had to, of course, get all these things set. We didn't do a static test on it, except well, it was a static test, but it was a static test of the firing to see if all the remote controls worked properly. And they did. And we ran that test, and everything, there was no problems and everything. But sprinkled in amongst all of these sled tests that I had been running was also quite a few thermal analysis that I did for the other group. And so I was kind of constantly changing hats all the time through that. There were often there were other things that came up. We had a test that was set up by the government that was an international test that involved the United States, Britain, and Sweden. And they had set up a huge stack, well, they planned to have a huge stack of explosives like we used, and spread out in a field out there in the desert somewhere. And companies were to bring in their individual houses and vehicles and whatever that was ground-based and have them tested under those kind of conditions. And there was a small company out in California that had droned a couple of F-86 fighter planes that were like Korean War vintage, and kind of wings like that. And what they wanted to do was fly them over this explosion and kind of get data points on a full-scale airplane that was comparable to what we did on the ground. And they wanted us, my little office, my little guys, mainly me, to do this testing and be responsible for it. But my superiors said they didn't like it. They didn't like the sound of it, for they didn't know that much about the airplanes. They didn't know how good they were, if they'd fall apart. And of course, you can't have them crash on a test setup where you've got a lot of people from all over the world with very expensive experiments set up down there. So, and also my company didn't know what kind of pilots remote control pilots they had. They didn't know how accurate the airplanes were. So anyway, they agreed to do a little bit of it for them, but we weren't going to be responsible for it. And they made them, this was probably a requirement of the test up anyway, to do a structural analysis of not a testing of the airplanes before they flew. And so we arranged for them to do a vibration test on them that make sure that nothing fell off and that they could operate after that. So that I set that up and observed that nothing fell off the airplanes while they were testing it. So they were going to fly them. But then they wanted me to establish some kind of a trigger mechanism that we had before, because their method of doing this was to have the airplane circle off the test area some distance in a circular mode for a while, and then for me to establish when they should release from that holding area and proceed to the test site on a prescribed, direction and altitude and all that kind of stuff. Well, my people weren't too interested in doing that, because a lot of things can go wrong, and they didn't know how accurate it would be. But anyway, I modified my analysis and came up with a time for them to release from that holding area and fly up to the test site. I don't know what happened. I've tried to find out if they received any data from it, and I've found nothing to say they did. But I think what happened was that there was probably a hold in the countdown, and I was going to release them at a certain time in that countdown. And I think that occurred before the hold occurred. And when the hold occurred, that meant that they were beyond the test site or what they wanted. So that was one of the things that I went through. Didn't turn out right. And there was another one that didn't turn out too good either. I will mention Boeing was concerned about the bomb bay doors on B-52. Of course, it was flying long before we had a nuclear concern. But they were concerned about the bomb bay doors not responding properly after exposed to a nuclear event. They didn't know whether they'd jam, which pilots don't like to land with bomb loads, and they also didn't want them to jam the bombs while they were in the air. So they came up with a test program to see if they could determine that that wasn't a problem. And so what they set up was they got the actual bomb bay doors from an old plane where the bomb bay doors work properly, and mounted up on a couple of mounts, about 10, 15 feet above the ground, and we're going to light off explosions that would roll over them. We had a person out at Colorado Springs that actually was a member of our team, our program, our office, really. And I guess he was out there giving them advice on thermal or the protection for nuclear effects. Anyway, he knew of this test program. I mean, he became concerned about the amount of experience Boeing had in doing this kind of tests. So he wanted my boss to come out and go over the test setup before the test to see how it was going to be developed. Well, my boss got sick about the time, and so about the time he was supposed to leave, and so they said, well, let's send Dale. And at the last minute, and so I rushed around and flew out there. But I didn't get there in time to get out to see the model and setup before they had the explosives stacked. And of course, they don't allow anybody out there except the explosives people that do the stacking after they started that process before the test. So they ran the test anyway the next morning, and we looked at the data, and goodness, it looked bad. Looked like they had a lot of deflection from the doors, and So the doors may have been damaged, maybe damaged, or they may have even had struck the bombs. And so the Boeing people, the test occurred on Friday, and as quick as the Boeing people saw that, they took off for home in Kansas City, where they didn't do any investigation or anything. So the cohort that worked out there was down there with me, and he said, well, I think we should go up and see what's going on. So, well, before we went up, of course, we made that decision while we were at the Roach Coach, which is the dear thing we call their food truck. And we decided to go up there and see what happened. And then we expected to see a lot of damage and so forth, that there was at least evidence that something had occurred. So we climbed up a ladder, I don't know, it's, like I say, it was 10 or 15 feet up, and crawled through the shrouds and everything, and got back to where the bomb bay doors open, and they were open up to the sky. And we looked at the setup, and we couldn't see any damage around the hinges or anything, or any indication that they had moved much. So then we started looking at the way they had done this, their instrumentation that they were using, and it kind of resembled what happens when you, or used to happen at the vegetable area at the supermarkets, when you throw something heavy on the scale, you know, it bounces. Well, that's kind of the way this was set up. So it was, when you get a blast wave, it's an instantaneous thing. I mean, it's like that. And if you don't have instrumentation that can measure that, you don't have a test. So what are they going to do? You know, the test people out there run out of money. The explosives were out there, and so after discussing a little bit, I said, well, I've got a suggestion. It's not a high-tech suggestion. And of course, they were anxious to hear it. Well, what I suggested was that they mount some kind of a thing from directly under the doors up to close to the doors out of wood, and drill holes in it and establish little dowels in it, little dip, that maybe a 1/4 inch distance, and then have a hammerhead that was hooked onto the doors that would be setting on the first one, and then if they got a deflection, they'd start tearing these things off. So I wasn't going to stay around and wait any longer, so I went home. But they called me later and said, well, they got, doing it that way, they got somewhere between 0 and, well, a slight deflection and a 1/4 inch. So anyway, they're not concerned about the bombs. But if there were little tests coming up all the time that I was involved in, and it seemed like every time I did one or got involved in one, it didn't turn out very well. Not my fault, but their fault. And I wanted to show you the scale of the models that I was using out there. And that's that guy there that's holding the clipboard and trying to look important. It's me, of course. But so they're about 6 feet tall, and you got the Air Force guys that help set it up. Anyway, that got around, and that kind of finished got to the last test that we were going to run. And this was a very special test because of several reasons. First of all, it was for the next, for the B-2 stealth bomber. Now, this was a plane that was going to be produced, and whenever you get a plane that's going to be produced, you want to know exactly how it's going to perform. So there's money to do the testing. So we got a very good model that was made by the Northrop, the company that built the airplane. So it was very good. I didn't get too involved with that. But, and also there was money for adequate testing. Instead of doing 3 runs, we did 10, all different. So we wanted to get 30 data points. And I think the last thing that was special about it was that it was classified top secret. And people often ask me when they hear about my involvement, what does top secret involve? So I'll take a minute to give you an understanding of what that involved. As, of course, I had to go out and get instructions on what it involved. But I could not tell anybody what I was working on. I couldn't tell my family. The only people that I could tell were people that were cleared into this particular program. Couldn't talk to my associates out at unless there was my boss who was cleared in to the program. And there was, we had to establish a special vault in our office that was key operated and even had vents and grates in the vents of air into the room to make sure nobody came in. And when I went in to get information like reports and stuff to use in my analysis, I had to take a container that would completely enclose my material to take back to my office. When I got to my office, I had to lock the door because most of my cohorts in there were not cleared into this program. And I also had to pull the shade at the window. Well, I was on the second floor, but I thought maybe they were worried about that little robin that came and laid eggs out there every spring. I didn't know if the Russians had something like that. So anyway, and it involved quite a bit of travel, back and forth out to California, and also to the sled track because it was down there. And of course, when I traveled, I couldn't tell anybody where I was going, or who I was going to see. I had to use my personal credit cards to pay for housing and the rental a car and meals and everything like that. And when I was flying, I couldn't have anything that displayed my company logo or anything that they knew where I was working for. And I had to have a cover story in case I met somebody that I used to work for and who started questioning me about where I worked. And I did. I had a guy that asked me what I was doing now. And my story was, well, I'm consulting with a company out west, and then I quickly changed the subject. That wasn't exactly true, but it wasn't too far off if you use that. Anyway, and So I had to also have lodging that was at least 15 miles from where we were going to meet. And they wanted you to take alternate trips or alternate routes to work, if possible. And like I say, at least be 15 miles away from where I was going to work. And then there were some special things that were required if you went on a military base, like I went to Holloman all the time. And I had to, of course, everything was arranged beforehand. Excuse me. I would meet a person from the base at a vacant parking lot that belonged to some kind of a business, and he would give me a pass to get on the base after looking at my driver's license, of course, so that I didn't have to sign in at the gate, and I could proceed out to where we were going to meet. And we met at various places all over out in the mountains and places like that where people wouldn't be around. And we made a point never to park exactly at the office there that was associated with the sled track, because we didn't want people to know that we were going to test on that. And then all of the tests were run late at night. And the military police would establish a stay-out zone of like 3 miles around the entire base, or the entire test area. And we also had a schedule of when the Russian satellite was going to fly over. And before it got there, we would douse the lights that were necessary to set up our set, and cover the model. And the rest of us sort of hide under something so we didn't give off any response until that was over. So that the testing had to be done at real late at night. And the only other thing I do remember about it was that I could not leave the lower 48 states without getting permission, even on vacation. Couldn't go to Hawaii or anywhere, Mexico, Canada, couldn't go there without permission. So that program, like many of the others, didn't quite start off on the right foot. We were all set up. I'd gone through all the preliminary stuff, and we had the model and had it all designed and instrumented and everything, and ready to take out to the track, and had a pre-test meeting. And all of the people that were involved were sitting around the table, and the manager of the test facility out there came in and said, well, gentlemen, I don't know if there's any ladies there or not, but said, we got a problem. He said, the model is not located at the correct angle. In this test that we ran 30 tests, and that one of the things that was changed was the model, the angle of what the model was set, because for stealth particularly, you wanted to fly close to the ground, and of course, so you'd be under the radar. But he said, look, we got this many runs and a lot of different variables here. He said, if we maybe make some changes in the way this is all set up, maybe we can get these 30 conditions without, making just minor changes in how it's set up. And so everybody said, well, okay, let's try and see it. And so we all sat around and, I don't know, we worked for several hours. And, nobody seemed to get a feel for it. And then finally, I think it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, one of the guys says, I got it. And we said, oh, great. And so we started checking off, and everybody agreed that, yeah, we got all of them in. And then I spoke up and said, no, wait a minute. You're missing this one. And then they looked and said, yeah, we did. So that meant that we couldn't run the test. And of course, I thought, oh, well, that's going to be on the star in my crown. But as I got to thinking about it, I wasn't too sure that I should take much credit for that, because I thought, what if that guy hadn't discovered his error, and they'd run the test, and I had been out there and checked things over, and I hadn't discussed it, and we'd run the test. It might have destroyed the whole test program, because if you try to get all the data and make it all combined to make sense, and you get 3 things that don't make sense, it throws a cloud over the whole thing. Anyway, well, my manager was proud of me, but I wasn't too great on it. Well, anyway, we finished the program, and everything worked great. And so that kind of ended the testing that we did on the test track. But before that, I leave that area. I got to tell you about a story that my wife, Jean, bless her heart, asked me to tell when I first gave this, and I'm sure that she's probably looking down now and going to check on me. But anyway, just a brief thing. Anyway, when I was in the early part of this top secret program, I was probably finishing off the cruiser, the engine thing. I got a call while working out there that said, there's a meeting tomorrow in California that you need to attend. And so I think they said they'd set up reservations and everything for me. And so I rushed back to the motel and grabbed my travel bag and headed for El Paso, and gave Jean a kiss and said, I'll be back. Well, when we go back home, and especially when we were with our gang of friends, and Jean wanted to kind of rib me a little bit. She'd say her vision of what happened out there wasn't like that, quite like that. She said, Dale invited me to go out to West with him and spend a week. And I'd no sooner got there than he left me out in the middle of the desert, didn't even tell me where he was going. About pretty close. Well, so that ended that program, and all went well, and my management was very pleased with the way it went. And then again, something came up that another program developed, and I kind of hate to even mention this because it was not the best program, but anyway, you got to get all of it in anyway. It was a program that some of our super scientists out at Colorado Springs had thought up that would improve the accuracy of laser weapons. Now, you know, a laser weapon is made to focus on a point and burn a hole in it, but any platform almost that you have is going to be subjected to certain vibrations of motion due to motors and people walking and everything. It's hard to really get everything out. So I came up with an idea of how this might be done. And they were going to fly it on the Space Shuttle program. And so when I heard about it, I was told that I was going to be the thermal analyst for the plane. And so we had to get with NASA first, and they would tell us all of the things we had to work with and the limits that we had, like we had to have limit on weight and limit on volume and the limit on time that we could use this and that, and we had to tell them how much time to do with the experiments and all that kind of thing. We had another company, a sister company out in, well, it wasn't a sister company, but it was another company out in California that was going to fly a small test with us of their own. So we had to get with them also and do kind of a preliminary analysis to get all of this worked in so it fit into their facility. And anyway, we did that. And of course, when you're doing preliminary analysis like that, when you really don't know what you're doing, it's a little bit subjective. But anyway, we did it, and we got permission to do it. Again, I thought, what am I going to do now until people get to a state where it's going to be some analysis to be done? And again, they came in with a program, with something that I would have to do. And that was, I was supposed to be well, I don't think it had a title, but anyway, I called it the technical monitor of one of the three major subcontractors we had on the program. And they were located close to us. And my job was to keep in touch with them on a very close basis to determine what problems they had, and witness testing that they might be doing, and keep current with the schedule and keep our management informed of what was going on with this particular subcontractor. And he said, my manager said, well, but they're having a contract negotiation meeting tomorrow, and I think you need to go sit in on it because you need to know who all the players are and get acquainted with them. He said, you're not going to be have anything to do with the money or the programming of any kind, but you need to get involved. And this was going to be, as like you say, on the Space Shuttle program. That's this thing right here. And this particular thing here, of course, is it's got the main fuel container, and it's again a liquid because, as you know, the shuttle had scientists go up and do experiments. That was the main fuel system. The rocket engines were attached on the shuttle part of it, and had two solid propellant engines on there to help it get off the pad. And then when it got into orbit, you could open it up and do your experiments. And this program was involved in two accidents. The first time was 1986, and you'll remember they had a school teacher from New Hampshire was on that, and it blew up shortly after it left the pad, And the problem was caused because the attachment of one of these solid rockets had an insulation material that was not good at low temperatures. And the launch occurred when it was fairly cool in Florida. And they finally realized that the material had failed and allowed gases to impinge on this main thing here, and it blew up. I happened to be down in Florida on vacation, and there was, of course, made a special trip over to see that launch, and it's still a vivid part of my memory to see that these two rockets going like this and stuff flying all over the sky and floating down. And of course, I think the other problem occurred in 2003 when the insulation that was on this shuttle thing was damaged. Now, one of the things that they tried to sell this program on was that the solid engine and this were all recoverable. And of course, this being a shuttle, they could fly it back into Earth. But they recover it all, and they would save money. They wouldn't refurbish it and so forth. But what the problem they had with the 2003 accident, they determined, was that a piece of foam insulation that they had on this heating tank, or fuel tank, had fallen off and had hit one of the tiles. These were tiles that were glued on here, and it damaged it. I don't know whether it damaged, completely damaged it or just made it loose. But anyway, on the re-entry, it failed. And hot air, hot gases got into the internal thing, and it wasn't structurally sound at higher temperatures, and it just came apart over Texas, and of course, both crews were completely lost. This particular program received quite a bit of criticism because of these failures, and also because they hadn't made proper accounting for how to save the crews. In other words, they didn't have an escape system on it, and there was nothing that the crews could do to get safely off of the thing. In fact, if they had something like they had on the Apollo, they could have lifted them off probably down at the Cape and saved at least the second group. We also could have thought that they should have had material on board and made an extra let the astronauts go out and repair the damage. And so the program got quite a bit of criticism for that, and they just hadn't really done a complete job. They did a analysis to determine what they thought the rate of problems would be, and they thought it would be they'd have a disaster like once in every 100 or 100 to 1 in every 1,000 flights. Well, they flew 125 flights with people on board, had two things, but they did a final analysis of that, and the analysis came out that it would be like 1 in 9. So it really was due some criticism. But anyway, the program that I was on here talking about got started. And I did go to the meeting and sat in the corner while the negotiations was going on. And I had sat there for 2 days in the corner, not saying a word, while the negotiation was going on. And I don't think either side had given up a dollar. And we were still about a factor of over 2 in variance. But anyway, the program got started. But after they just cut off negotiations, the chief negotiator from our corporate headquarters had a conference call with his boss, who was one of the senior vice presidents of the corporation, and told him about the problem we had, and that we'd broken off negotiations. Well, this vice president went berserk, criticized all of the negotiators and the subcontractor and everything. Well, but the program got started, and immediately after it got started, of course, I took my job seriously and went over and talked with the manager and told him what I was going to do, and he agreed that he'd help me out and give me all the information that was needed to satisfy my superiors. Well, about 3 weeks later, we had our first monthly program review meeting at their facility. And we sat in a big room, and everybody introduced themselves. And so I knew who the senior vice president was, and I was really very surprised to see him there. And I thought, well, I hope I don't really have any interface with him, and because his criticism of everything, of course, had a lot of profanity involved in it. But anyway, this meeting started, and they got to the giving where they stood on the thing. And when they got to the schedule, the guy said, well, we're slightly behind schedule, but we're going to catch up, you know, which is what I had reported. And but they didn't want that. They said, exactly, what do you mean by slightly? You know, well, turned out that slightly meant that we were like a month into the program, and we're already 10 to 15 days behind schedule. So that was not anything that excited them too much. We had a break, and immediately when we broke, this vice president said, Dale, I'd like to see you. And he took me across the hall and closed the door on an empty office, sat me in a chair. Of course, he stood up and in front of me and started in, and I thought, well, this is going to be rough on me, and I may not have a job after today. And anyway, he started, and after he'd given about 2 sentences, I said, wait a minute. I said, look, I reported to the program manager of this, your guy who was also vice president, and gave him exactly what they gave me. And I said, I see a problem that we have in this schedule I've got because it isn't detailed enough in the tasks that had to be done and in the time scale that is shown. I said, and next week, the next program review meeting, you'll have it. And he paused for a minute, and he said, okay. And that ended that meeting. Well, the program got going, and it never got on schedule. I went over and I suggested overtime. I suggested hiring new people. I said, well, can we do some of the analysis in sequence, or in a parallel, rather, in sequence, and, anything I could think of that might get the thing back on schedule. And he said, no, can't do it. So I even got, asked his permission if I could go talk to his boss. And I went in and did, and I went in and talked to him, who was also vice president. Well, he didn't throw me out of the office, but he didn't agree to anything I said anyway. But anyway, it went on like that. And I got the feeling that I was kind of like the tail trying to wag the dog. Like, nothing I could do would do anything. I couldn't go talk to the engineers. Of course, I didn't really know exactly what they were doing. But anyway, it went like that, and finally about, I guess it was probably 6 weeks or 6 months before the end of the program, just before a day before the monthly program reviews, I got a telephone call from the secretary of the vice president, who was the program manager. And she said, Jim would like to have you and the vice president, the senior vice president, meet him for breakfast at Denny's or someplace tomorrow before the meeting at 7:30 or something like that, and give us a complete rundown on what's right to the date of what's going on. So that's what I did for about 6 months. Every month I had breakfast with 2 vice presidents and gave them a review. And just before the program ended, I did get some thermal analysis to be done. One of the subcontractors submitted a report that was incorrect. I found incorrect, and I had to travel to get that resolved. But anyway, the program finally got canceled. So I felt bad about it, but nothing I could do. But I did check to see what the final costs were. And we had originally scheduled it, or planned to provide $3.5 million to solve this, complete this program, this part of the program. And their final cost was closer to $15 million. So I didn't feel right about it, but there was nothing I could do. But anyway, that kind of ended my career right there, because there weren't no more projects coming out and everything. But in summarizing, I did feel that I had a very interesting career, very varied things to do. I had a couple of disciplines, a lot of travel, which wasn't bad. And, I could even include Gene in a few things that I did. And I worked with some very important people and very smart people. And I also realized that I got a lot of help from upstairs. Because I just had a limited education. It was good, but with all the help of people holding my hands as I went through, came out all right. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you learned a little something and it wasn't too technical.
I don't know about you, but I am in awe of this guy. Oh, my word, you are smart, Dale. Super smart.
Oh, no.
Yeah, you are. So, any questions? Does anybody have any questions for Dale? I am amazed that you remember all these details. Oh, my goodness gracious.
Well, I was often asked, anytime I mentioned that I was an aerospace engineer, people go, oh, you were, and they asked me questions and about different things, and the kids were always wanting to know, what'd you do, Dad, you know? And I would tell them what I did and so forth. One of the cute things was that I mentioned at one of the times when people were questioning me that the top secret stuff that I had to go through was similar to the type of things described in the book called Area 51. I don't know if any, you know what it is, but it was a secret area down in Arizona, somewhere around there, where they did all these special tests, you know, and when they heard that, they thought I knew something about aliens. Because it's close to the aliens down there. And I have not been able, to this date, in order to completely convince my daughters that I don't know something about aliens.